So I'll be hosting this session looking at adaptability in humanities, and really the point of our next speakers are really to consider how we as practitioners look at creativity and how we challenge our own thinking and the processes of our own thinking and our mental pathways and our mental maps, and how we consider the development of our emergency plans and our recovery plans, but also the way in which we approach working with communities in creative and in innovative ways so that we can deliver the best outcomes for our communities. So I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Stuart Andrews and Dr. Patrick Duggan, who are directors of the Performing City Resilience, I don't want to say research group, that's a project, that's the right word, project, to talk to us this afternoon. Over to you, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, for joining. We hope this will be an interesting, informative session. Very happy to chat about this. We're aware it might be a bit left field, so it'll be interesting to see how it lands. I'm Stuart Andrews. I'm a senior lecturer at Brunel University, London.
Hello. I'm Dr. Patrick Duggan. I'm Associate Professor of Performance and Culture at Northumbria University in Newcastle. So we thought it would be useful to give you an overview of what we're going to do, and then we'll move into the presentation proper. We are running a project called Performing City Resilience, which has been running since about 2018, that looks at the intersection of arts and performance and emergency planning and resilience practices. Stuart will say a bit more about that. So today we're going to outline that project and give you a sense of what we're up to, try to contextualize why it might be important that people from the arts are in rooms like this with people that are emergency planners and doing that work that we're not doing. So we're not emergency planners. And then we're going to go through some creative practices, broadly defined. Don't let the term worry you or scare you. We're going to show you some case studies and some different perspectives on questions of resilience that we think emerge from the arts and how that's working.
So we thought it might be useful to tell you a bit about the project. Some of you may be aware of it already, in which case apologies for effectively duplicating the same material because it's the same project. It's a research and research impact project, so we're very concerned that this is not just a conversation among academics, that it's useful in real-world ways. We're interested in the ways that arts practitioners and culture bearers and emergency planners work. We think there are very powerful ways in which they do not unrelated stuff, and they come from very similar perspectives in the way they think about the world and the way they think about society. So we're interested in what productive engagements could happen between those groups. So we research, develop and broker new understandings, practices, strategies between arts, culture and emergency planning. So some of that is proper on the ground stuff, others is more strategic development. The kind of practices that we're engaged in while we're doing this work involve things like surveying and analysis, so looking at places and the ways in which those might be managed and what might be managed differently, and the practices that are being done in arts, culture and emergency preparedness. We run workshops on a range of different themes. We can talk to you about those. Some of those are bespoke, some of those are a little more standardized. We prefer working with bespoke workshops. We like working with people in ways that are specific to them. We make recommendations. We often call them invitations because we don't like telling people what to do. We like suggesting some things that might be of interest. Again, we're not in your field. We don't want to tell you what to do. We'd rather find interesting ways of offering suggestions. And we publish. We publish peer-reviewed academic work. We've got a book forthcoming, Rethinking Resilience, focusing on work in New Orleans. But we also do very professional focused work. So we've done reports. We do a lot of blogging, with those kind of things to try and get material into the public realm. We don't just want to write academic books that, frankly, nobody reads.
We thought it would also be useful to say a bit about what we've done to this point to sort of contextualize where we're at with the project. We've been working in the US, principally in New Orleans, although we've done a little bit of work in Albuquerque as well, and in the UK through a UK research and innovation grant that was a COVID rapid response grant that led to work with the EPS, in fact. In New Orleans, we've had some impact in the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, really looking at the ways in which they might take seriously the voice of culture bearers in the city in their emergency planning, in their practices around how that's communicated to communities and in the ways in which they integrate the knowledge and practices from those communities in what they do next. So some of our research made its way into their emergency preparedness plan that was released in 2021. Some of our work, we later found out, influenced some COVID-19 vaccination response that we're going to talk about a bit later in more detail. And it led also to the first time that the emergency preparedness team in New Orleans did work directly with an arts organisation on a National Endowment for the Arts grant. So really starting to get that office to recognise the importance of practices that are from beyond the resilience community directly and to think in different ways about that. We've also had some impact, as you might expect, given our disciplines in cultural strategy. So the London Borough of Newham has used our research as part of its underpinning evidence base for its cultural strategy being released up to 2030, I think it is. And in the US, we changed the cultural strategies of organisations like the Arts Council of New Orleans and the Southern Rep Theatre and the Marigny Opera House to recognise the importance of the work that they were doing in terms of civic responsibility and resilience in the areas that they are based in New Orleans. The COVID work that we did led to a number of different conversations with colleagues at the EPS. We did some huddles online where we rehearsed some of the activity that we were engaged in and talked through those issues with members. And one of the things that emerged from that was a need to think differently about personal debriefing. And we were invited by the EPS to create a toolkit that helps look at how personal debriefing strategies that emerge from performance can be useful in professional practice and personal development. And we'll come back to that a bit later on. That work has led to creativity being recognised in the core competencies of the EPS, which is really exciting. And then we've had more broad impact with EP teams across the UK in terms of community engagement and building trust practices with communities, which has been talked a lot about in the last 2 days, in some policy and strategy development, practices of team working, and communication strategies in coma sites. So we say that not to boast, and we hope it doesn't sound too much like we're boasting, but rather to say that this work has begun to have impact in the work that people in emergency planning are undertaking.
Okay, so we did some slight rejigging of this presentation, having attended yesterday's talks, because we thought it would be useful to speak directly to that. And while we were talking about bringing the framework into the talk, actually it seemed useful to focus on that. Partly because if that's a direction that the field of emergency planning might be going in, then it would be interesting for us to think about how our work speaks to that. And it's not that our work preempted the framework, although we are quite interested that some of the things it's talking about echo some of the thoughts we'd had about the ways in which emergency planners are engaged in concerns with other areas of society, and there are already clear and significant connections in that realm. So we were excited about the way in which the framework speaks to society. Some comments that emerged yesterday from Kavanagh's presentation were things like the idea of empowering and supporting everyone who can contribute. To be truly resilient, resilience must involve all parts of society. Our understanding of risk must be sophisticated. Risk information needs to be tailored to audiences beyond government, building thinking on resilience into everyday policy. And then from the framework itself, we were struck by the lines that the framework will ensure that the knowledge and skills of the diverse people and organisations that exist in our society are enabled to contribute their fullest to local planning. And we've been really struck by this whole society approach as a way of thinking about resilience. What are the organisations, the mention of faith-based centres earlier that Nathan talked about, that open first? In the US, we've been acutely aware that arts centres do not dissimilar things and provide powerful spaces that could be productively used as interesting opportunities for rest centres, for situation rooms, in all kinds of ways. So we want to unpack that notion of society. Can we have the next slide, please? So our approach to this, we draw here on Asali Devan Ecclesiastes, who runs a centre in New Orleans that we'll talk about shortly, the Ashe Cultural Arts Centre. And we're acutely aware that New Orleans faces very significant and very long-standing racism. There's huge issues of poverty. There are huge social issues based on the way in which, for instance, tourism operates in the city and skews the way that people come to the city and how that operates. And her sense, therefore, is that there is a lack of trust, and we're aware that the trust deficit was talked about the other day. And she says, Who folks do trust and hold in esteem and look up to for social guidance are the artists and culture bearers, the people in the community who make music, who make Indian suits, who are chefs and culinary artists or poets, spoken word artists, singers. She's talking about New Orleans, although that seems really important because we're not suggesting in any way that there are models of the culture or the arts of emergency planning that should be widely implemented. Cities should be recognisable like this. You should read a line like this and go, I know exactly which city that is. We want locally situated practices. Also, something we like about this is the fact that there's a breadth of practices. She's not just talking about singers or theatre makers or painters. She's talking about chefs. She's talking about a whole raft of people who are engaged in a set of practices. And if we think about a whole society approach to resilience, then these people have to be threaded through that understanding of what whole society is, particularly if these are the people who are trusted when conventional forms of authority have been distrusted, particularly by minoritized groups in society.
And I think that resonates with conversations that we were having earlier around EDI and the processes of going through some of the emergency planning practices that unfold. What we want to do now is try to illustrate what we're getting at here through some case studies that we've analysed in various places. And we're trying here to suggest ideas rather than to say that any of the case studies that we're going to show you are the things that should be rolled out. So this isn't about saying, this is how you do it, take this model and slap it down in your context. It's about saying, what can you take from these ways of thinking, this approach, that might be valuable in the environments in which you're working. And you can take any aspect of it, or you can take big chunks of it, that's fine. Again, it's about trying to lean into that idea of what are sophisticated understandings of resilience and how does interdisciplinarity play into that sense of sophisticated, complex problem solving as we move into an ever-increasingly complex world. So the first case study is one from New Orleans, and it looks at the way in which resilience planners in that city leveraged cultural and performance practices of New Orleans as a means of engaging communities that were very skeptical about the vaccine, very skeptical of authority, and really didn't take kindly to being told what to do. And this short video, which we found out from the Hazard Mitigation Office, was partly influenced by conversations we'd had in the city in 2019, leveraged the cultural vernacular of New Orleans as a means of talking to people about what they were missing by not getting vaccinated. So we had social aid and pleasure clubs out in the video rolling up their sleeves and saying, get a jab. We had baby dolls performing, brass bands under the I-10. These are all cultural markers of a place that are significant and important to the people that live there. So this is community leaders, cultural leaders and artists talking to the people that they represent in daily life and daily practice and saying, this is a means of response. This is a way of coming from the complex problem that we're in to a point where we might begin to recover through vaccination. It took New Orleans from a place where vaccination uptake was extremely low and it was very slow to being one of the most successful case studies in the US in terms of vaccination uptake and the eventual speed with which that rolled out through the community. So cultural practices become really vital to means of communication. What we find interesting about this is that it's not only a kind of targeted use of arts practice. This is not asking people to do things different from what they normally do. It's packaged around a particular message. But this is cultural practice from that place being deployed for a particular reason. And we think that's a really interesting performance of resilience in lots of different ways.
Okay, so from New Orleans to Leeds. So this is Slung Row Theatre. You may know the theatre. They run a working men's club, I think the oldest working men's club in England, if not the UK. And they make theatre shows. That's what they do. We have probably a broad sense of what a theatre company do. And when the pandemic hit, they weren't able to do that so much. But they were like, we've got a van and we can do stuff, so what should we do? So they decided that they're a company who tells stories. That's what they do. That's what theatre makers do. And so the story they would tell is that no one in Holbeck and Beeston, where they work and live, would go hungry. So they opened a food bank, and they made it a non-means-tested food bank. And people told them it was a stupid idea because it'd be really hard to manage, and how would they get the food? And they went, well, we don't want anyone to go hungry. That's the way we're going to do it. And so they got food from all kinds of places. I think Amanda Coleman yesterday talked about the importance of the loudhailer. At one stage, I think on many stages, they had a loudhailer and a van full of frozen food going, come and get the food now before it defrosts. And they drove through the streets until everyone had taken all of the food and it was gone. This, on one level, it's not theatre, but it is performance, the performance of walking on a street with a loudhailer, of getting people to do something, of imagining the streets become a kind of performance space. And a company that's good at doing performances on stage is probably also quite good at doing performances in other places too, particularly as so many performance makers now focus on site and place and community stories and community understandings. If you want to engage with local community issues, go and meet the theatre makers and the performance makers in a community who do that day in, day out, and have a conversation, as Nathan was talking about with the mosque. There are exciting opportunities here, we find. So, as well as doing the food bank, they also became a social referral lead for the council. So they solved all kinds of problems. So people would phone up within 48 hours. They'd do all manner of things that they were entirely unused to doing, but able to do within COVID. They created an art tour. They got people from the local area to make pictures, and they fixed them onto lampposts. They laminated them and put them onto lampposts. The council was very cross because they hadn't sought permission. But if you're only going out for an hour's walk every day, what a beautiful thing to go and see pictures from these other people who are in a place who you can't see anymore. Again, we're not suggesting that everybody does this. We're not suggesting you should break all the council rules, because I think that would go down badly. Or I don't know, it's tricky to read the room. But there are ways of playfully engaging with everyday life that might be profoundly powerful. They then made pop-up performances. When it was more possible to do pop-up performances, and actually if you read their book on it, it was a bit suspect how possible it was at the time, but they put up pop-up tents in a car park, they marked the areas out, they made them fun spaces so that you're not going, this is an incredibly dangerous thing, who would do this? Why are we seeing theatre now? It's a place where you've got your own little space to see a performance on a flatbed truck. They're changing our understanding of what life is like in a pandemic through arts and cultural practice. And they're using the practices and skills that they already have. And throughout our argument, we're not asking artists to do different stuff. We're asking artists to do the same stuff that they're good at doing. We're not saying you have to do this thing. We're going, what can you do? What would you like to do? What are you already doing? Many artists are already doing this stuff. Yes, I do. So the sign, the big thing that I should probably have talked about, they put up at Christmas, as part of a Christmas show. And they put it up on the outside of the building when it became apparent we were going into lockdown. Because it's not a beautiful thing to go back into lockdown. So let's find a way of talking to the local community and going, we can get through this. Let's find a way. We go again tomorrow, lads. And so we liked that and the way it speaks to the people of a place and is there every night illuminated for the people who live in that area. Oh, is it me again? Goodness. Excellent. Thank you very much. So we've shown you one example, which is a city engaging with artists going, well, let's think about how you work in culture bearers and how we can engage that into resilience needs. And then we've looked at how a theatre company, all by themselves, partly because they didn't require council money, they just did stuff. We're now going to look at a couple of examples where we've begun to intervene a little bit. So one of the things we're particularly concerned about is situational control rooms. These are the spaces where you are managing complex, messy, difficult situations. So if we're thinking about mental health, if we're thinking about how you manage multiple crises, how nice are those spaces to work in? Let's forget about the technology and think about, is there a sofa? What are the ways in which we can make sure that those spaces are designed to engage people in valuable communal ways that make the experience a little bit nicer, a little bit better. And one of the things we were interested in was how arts venues have been designed to welcome people in. This is the Ashe Cultural Arts Centre. A lot of their work is within a particularly black-owned area of town. There's a degree of poverty there. This has been there through thick and thin. So that foyer that you can see, where you can see into this space from outside, so it's not hidden away, that was where a lot of people went to fill in their FEMA forms after Katrina, and the same thing after Hurricane Ida. So although it's an art centre and it's probably a nice to have thing, actually it was fundamentally important as the place that you go where you trust people to help you fill in those forms that will change your life. But what can we learn about art centre spaces like that, that are designed to be welcoming, engaging and all those kind of things? How can we make this, one of the 3 New Orleans situation rooms, a little bit nicer to be in? How also can we use understandings of situation rooms to help us better understand how art centres can operate as situation rooms of a kind for their community? We can think about distributed electricity, we think about solar panels on the roof, making it comfortable, making it a warm space. If art centres have that potential to deal with a situation locally, that makes them profoundly important spaces.
And so this is the last of the case studies that we'll talk through, and it's really reflecting on the ways in which processes of performance making might be valuable in the context of emergency planning. So through the COVID project that we were doing, and in conversation with colleagues at the EPS, we became aware of this need to think about what personal debriefing looked like. It became apparent through conversations with people in the emergency planning community that the transition between work and life in the context of managing a pandemic was incredibly difficult. So one of the questions that we were asked was, is there a way that performance making might be valuable to answering how you manage that context? So through a series of conversations and through a series of practical experiments and huddles that we ran, we came up with this idea of a toolkit of creative strategies for personal debriefing. This document's available through the EPS and on our website. Have a read. You might hate it. That's fine. But it might spark some ideas. It might give you some suggestions that could be valuable. And what we're doing in it is really thinking about approaches to reflective practice, personal developmental practice that emerge from other disciplines, from performance principally. And it introduces performance as a flexible and dynamic tool, a way of thinking that might be valuable in the context of professional execution of your duties. Part of this is to do with a need to understand the value of arts and performance practices beyond their oft-cited nice-to-haveness. And one of the problems with the arts is that they are very often seen in terms of the end product, the thing that you encounter, the painting on the wall, the performance that you see in a theatre, the film that you download. But actually, the processes behind those end products are incredibly powerful. They're very acutely engaged in complex problem solving. And so we wanted to see whether we could leverage that in the context of emergency planning. So it builds personal practices from instruction-based performance to see whether or not they might be adapted and used in the context of a personal form of debriefing or working with colleagues in your environment. They range from activities that you can undertake in 3 minutes while a kettle boils, all the way through to a daily practice that might run for a year. And we're drawing here on a range of practitioners across performance, and we reference those in it. But what's interesting about this is what it might suggest, what might be possible if we take a creative approach to addressing some of the professional challenges that are playing out in your working careers. So, why are we here? What value might this have to the work that's being undertaken in emergency planning? The key principle for us in this project is that artists are already engaged in addressing the challenges from which they make work. So an artist in a given situation will be involved in thinking through the impact of the climate change on their given circumstances. So artists, we argue, are already involved in resilience and emergency planning at some level, if we understand their work through that lens. We would also argue that emergency planning and resilience planning is a deeply creative practice. It's engaged in rehearsing. You do exercises. It's engaged in scripting. You write plans and policies. It's engaged in stage management and the execution of very particular roles in a very particular moment in front of a live audience. This is not to glibly map performance onto emergency planning or vice versa, but actually to suggest that there is a shared embodied practice at play between these two areas of work that might be valuable to think through. The arts can appear elitist and exclusionary or different. More often than not, old theatre buildings come with high codification. You have to know the codes of access, what it means to go into that space. That feels difficult sometimes. We might try and interrogate that in the work that we're doing here. But very often, the arts are just seen as nice to have. They don't really matter very much. They're not very important. They don't really do anything. I think that's a misstep. The arts tell us about the world around us in really complex, nuanced, and sophisticated ways. That's their point. That's what they do. So if we're going to build trust with communities, if we're going to be able to execute the duties of resilience planning, if we're going to have chief resilience officers who meaningfully engage in networked thinking with communities around them, we have to think in different ways about what it means to do that. The arts can be valuable in brokering those ways of thinking. So the arts are problem solving. They are engaged in that. That's their point. If we're going to take a whole society approach to resilience, we're being asked to leverage the skills, experience, and knowledge and practices beyond those that are most regularly represented in resilience literature, for example. Our argument is that we should take seriously the work of artists and arts organisations in thinking about how we address resilience challenges and how do we broker the relationship between arts and emergency planning.
And so brokering is the key thing for us. That on one level, we could take some artists and we'll get some really nice ones, and we could take some emergency planners, also really nice ones, although probably all of you are, so actually that's not tricky, and then we'll put them in a room and something will happen. And the risk, therefore, is that there's some kind of muddle. There's some misconception of what each group does and what you need, and there's also a risk of power relations, that actually if your emergency planner is going, we have this really important thing to do and deal with, the artist is probably going to go, okay, what do you need? Because it's hard to argue with the gravity of some of the situations that you're dealing with. So we find brokering is really valuable in this context. How can we develop projects with partners that seem appropriate, that are mutually beneficial, where both partners will really gain something profound rather than fixing a singular problem? We're not really interested in fixing a singular problem. That's useful in the short term. The longer term is how do you build a productive local conversation between local stakeholders in an area. So brokering helps us break that, and a lot of our workshops, a lot of our work is about managing and brokering that experience between artists and emergency planners, and we've done that in a range of different contexts in the UK and the US. There are also other things here. The COVID inquiry, we've put up here monolithic thinking. I think we're probably all aware of the things that have emerged that possibly we knew about before, but certainly emerged through the COVID inquiry about the kind of thinking, the kind of people who were in a room doing that thinking. If you get a certain group, the focus is very particular. So there are historically marginalised voices, voices of women, voices of marginalised communities. We've addressed that very much in our work in New Orleans in terms of people of colour. There are extraordinary challenges here. So we need to be very, very sensitive to the different knowledges. And again, if we're talking about whole of society, we're talking about a lot of complexities here. So we would also argue, if we're thinking about the whole of society, if we're thinking about bringing in new voices, that we bring in different disciplines, that we look for productive ways, not ways that will interfere and muddy and waste your time, but ways that might bring in other related disciplines in productive ways, and bring in perspectives that are vital to problem solving and decision making, and really get at that sense of sophisticated engagement with risk, how we prepare for and how we manage that. So that's us. If you're interested in this work, we've done some writing, because that's what academics tend to fill their lives with. To the right, we've got some academic papers. Much of our work is open access. For instance, we've done some work on situation rooms. That's an open access paper. These ones over here to the left are more public-facing, more professional-facing. So we might point you particularly to the COVID report here, Performance of City Pandemic Response, Invitations to Innovate. Effectively, that lays out our approach, that introduces the approach early on and gives a series of challenges that emergency planners faced during the pandemic, ways in which you might engage with the arts community. And it does it in two ways. It addresses preparation, so that sense of way before a situation is emerging as a problem, this is how you might engage with the arts community. And also in that moment of response, you might not phone artists first, but who would you phone and how would you do it and why would that be useful in the moment of dealing with a challenging situation? And we felt it might be useful to begin to tease apart those. So that report may be useful in that context. There's the toolkit here. There's other stuff if you want to use the QR code there. We've got a website. We'd love to hear from you if this strikes a chord. But otherwise, thank you so much from us both for listening.